Whatever you do, don't go back to that room tonight. And don't let him know you heard me. She said it so quietly I almost thought I imagined it. But her eyes were steady, dead serious, and she was already walking away before I could ask a single question. My name is Tessa Harlow, and that night I was standing in the hallway of the Meridian Grand in Maui, still wearing the sundress I'd had on at dinner, holding a bucket of ice I never ended up needing. 3 days into my honeymoon, 3 days married to a man I thought I knew better than anyone on earth. I need to back up. My husband, I'll call him my husband because that's what he was, legally, technically, on paper. His name is Brandon. We met 4 years ago at a mutual friend's barbecue in Phoenix. He was funny and easy to talk to, and he had this way of making you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room. I'm a physical therapist. I work long shifts. I don't make a ton, but I've always been careful with money. My grandmother passed when I was 26 and left me a trust, not life-changing money by some people's standards, but significant. Enough that my dad sat me down before the wedding and said, quietly, carefully, the way he says things when he's worried but doesn't want to push, "You sure about the prenup situation, Tess?" I told him I was sure. I told him Brandon wasn't that kind of person. I told him I trusted my judgment. I was wrong about one of those things. The trust was set up in my maiden name, Harlow. It required my signature and my attorney's countersignature for any major movement of funds. Brandon knew about it. He'd known since we got serious, about 2 years in. He never seemed bothered by it. If anything, he seemed supportive. "Your money is your money," he used to say. I'd never touched that. And I believed him because what kind of person says that and means something else? We got married on a Saturday in late April. Small ceremony, outdoor venue, 60 guests. Everything exactly how I'd always pictured it. Brandon cried during the vows. Real tears. I remember thinking, this is real. This is the right thing. My best friend Sophie caught my eye from the 3rd row and mouthed, "He's a keeper." My mom squeezed my dad's hand. 3 days later, we were in Maui, and I was standing in a hotel hallway with a bucket of ice and a stranger's warning echoing in my ears. Let me tell you about the woman in the hallway. She was maybe 60, small-framed, wearing one of those linen blazers that looks casual but isn't. She had reading glasses pushed up on her head and a keycard in her hand, and she'd been standing near the elevator bank when I stepped out to get ice. I'd smiled at her the way you smile at strangers in hotels, polite, brief, forgettable. But she had looked at me for a moment too long, and then she'd stepped closer and said what she said. "Whatever you do, don't go back to that room tonight, and don't let him know you heard me." And then she was gone. Elevator doors closed. Hallway empty. I stood there for a full 30 seconds, maybe longer, ice bucket in my hands, the air conditioning humming above me. My first instinct was to laugh it off. My second instinct, the one I've learned to listen to since all of this, was the cold, quiet tightening in my chest that I'd felt twice before in my life. Once when a patient coded during a session. Once when my mom called me during work hours, and I knew before I picked up that something was wrong. I didn't go back to the room. Not right away. I set the ice bucket on the floor near the vending machine alcove, and I stood very still and I thought. Brandon had seemed distracted at dinner. I chalked it up to travel fatigue. He'd gotten 2 texts he angled away from me to read and said it was his buddy checking in from back home. He'd suggested I take a long bath after dinner. "You've been so stressed, babe, just relax." And I'd been grateful for it. I'd taken the bath. I'd used up the hotel lavender salt, and I'd been in there almost an hour. And when I came out, he was on the balcony on his phone, and he ended the call quickly and said it was nothing. That's when I'd said I was going to get ice. Now I stood in the hallway and I did not go back to the room. Instead, I walked slowly toward the end of the corridor, past our room, to the little sitting area near the stairwell. 2 chairs and a small table with a fake orchid that looked surprisingly convincing. I sat down. I pulled out my phone. I want to be clear. I was not in a movie. I was not a heroine. I was a 31-year-old woman in a sundress who had been married for 72 hours and was sitting in a hotel hallway at 9:45 at night because a stranger had scared her and she didn't know what to think. I opened the joint account app. Brandon and I had set one up 6 weeks before the wedding for household expenses. We both agreed on it. It made sense for splitting bills, and we each put in a starting amount. Nothing major. My real money was in the trust, untouched. But I had added Brandon as a beneficiary to one of my investment accounts 3 months before the wedding at his suggestion, because our financial planner had recommended updating beneficiary designations when you get married. Routine. Normal. Except, I looked at the account. There was a pending authorization request, a transfer request flagged for my approval that I had never initiated. $60,000. Pending. Waiting on my thumbprint. I sat there and I looked at that number and I felt the floor shift under me even though I was sitting in a chair that wasn't moving. $60,000 to an account I didn't recognize. The request had been created at 8:52 p.m. We'd gotten back from dinner at 8:30. The bath I'd taken started around 8:35. He'd had 17 minutes while I was in the bathroom, and the water was running and I couldn't hear anything. I didn't approve the transfer. I closed the app. My hands were steadier than I expected. I thought about going back to the room and asking him directly. I thought about screaming. I thought about calling my dad. I thought about the way Brandon had cried at our wedding and whether that had been real, and I sat with that question for a while in a way that felt like touching a bruise. You keep pressing because you can't quite believe it hurts that much. Then I did something that surprised even me. I got calm. Not the numb kind of calm, not the dissociated kind, the clear kind. The kind where everything narrows down and you know exactly what you need to do, and your hands stop shaking because the decision has already been made somewhere deeper than your hands. I called Sophie. Sophie answered on the second ring, because Sophie always answers on the second ring. She's been my best friend since sophomore year of college, and she is without question the most practically intelligent person I know. She was the maid of honor who made a spreadsheet for the wedding seating chart. She once talked me out of a terrible lease situation with what she called aggressive niceness and a paper trail. I told her what was happening, quietly, because even though I was around the corner from our room, I didn't want to take chances. She didn't panic. She said, "Okay, don't go back in until you know more. Can you get into the hotel lounge?" She paused. "Also, who was that woman in the hallway? Do you know her?" I said no. Sophie said, "Find her." I almost laughed, but Sophie wasn't laughing. I went back to the elevator bank. I pressed the button for the lobby. When the doors opened, I walked to the front desk and I asked, carefully, whether there was a guest, an older woman, linen blazer, reading glasses, around the 7th floor, who might have left me a message. I knew it was a long shot. I knew the desk clerk was going to look at me like I was slightly unwell. She didn't leave a message, but the clerk, a young guy with a name tag that said Marco and an expression that was professionally neutral, looked at me for a second longer than necessary and then said very quietly, "There's a woman waiting in the lounge. She said you might come." I found her at a table near the window, nursing what looked like club soda, still in the linen blazer. Up close she looked less like a stranger and more like someone's very composed aunt. "Sit down," she said. "I'll explain, but we don't have much time." Her name was Paulette. She told me that first, Paulette, and that she was a licensed private investigator, had been for 22 years, based out of Scottsdale. She told me she'd been retained 4 weeks ago by my father. She said those words plainly, watching my face. Retained by my father. "He never told me," I said. "He didn't want you to feel like he didn't trust your choice," she said. "He just wanted to be sure." She put a small manila folder on the table between us. I didn't open it right away. Paulette told me what was inside. She'd spent 4 weeks building a picture of Brandon that was very different from the one I had. Before me, there had been 2 other women, one in Denver, one in Tucson, both with assets, one an inheritance, one a settlement from a car accident. Both had relationships with Brandon that ended badly. The Denver woman had lost $40,000 before she figured out what was happening. She'd been too embarrassed to press charges. The Tucson woman had consulted an attorney, but Brandon had left the state by then. I sat very still. Brandon had done his homework on me early. He knew about the trust from a mutual friend before we even met, had specifically asked to be introduced. The barbecue where we'd met, the one that felt so organic and serendipitous, had not been random. He had engineered it. "The transfer request on your account tonight," Paulette said. "That's him testing whether you check. If you approve it, the next request will be larger. If you don't, he'll blame it on a glitch. He won't push until he has the paper trail he needs." "What paper trail?" I said. She told me. Brandon had drafted with help from someone, she wasn't sure who, a document that he planned to present to me in the next day or two as a financial planning tool, a spousal fund restructuring agreement. It sounded boring and bureaucratic, and it was designed to. But buried in the language was authorization for him to act as a co-manager of my trust assets for purposes of joint estate optimization, if I signed it. And why wouldn't I sign something so boring, something my husband handed me on our honeymoon with a pen? It would have given him enough legal foothold to initiate transfers that would take months to unwind even if I caught them. I opened the folder. His real name was still Brandon, but his last name wasn't what he told me. He'd changed it legally 3 years ago. Easy enough to do, nothing criminal about it alone. His background check, the one I hadn't run because I trusted him, would have shown the new name. Clean record. No red flags. Because the Denver woman never pressed charges and the Tucson woman had settled quietly, there was nothing to find unless you knew where to look. Paulette had known where to look. I sat in that lounge for probably 40 minutes. I asked questions, and Paulette answered them with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this before, probably many times, and who understood that you have to let people process at their own speed, even when the clock is running. At some point I said, "My dad knew all of this before the wedding?" "He suspected," Paulette said. "We only confirmed the full picture this week." "Why didn't he stop it?" She looked at me evenly. "You were already married. He didn't want to blow it up without giving you the information first. He wanted it to be your decision." I thought about my father's question the week before the wedding. "You sure about the prenup situation, Tess?" I thought about how I'd brushed it off, how I'd told him to trust my judgment. He had trusted my judgment. He just made sure I had backup. I went back upstairs. I didn't sleep in the room. I booked the second room on my own card, 2 floors up, and I went there instead. Before I did, I stood in the hallway outside our original room for a moment, and I listened. I could hear the low sound of the TV. He was still up, probably waiting for the transfer to go through, probably checking his phone. I did not knock. I did not go in. I texted my attorney. Her name is Robin. She's been my family's lawyer for 12 years, and she picks up text even at odd hours if the number is mine, and I laid it out for her in bullet points. She responded within 15 minutes. She said, "Don't sign anything, don't confront him alone, and get me a copy of that folder." She said she'd have a framework ready by morning. I lay on the bed in the second room, and I stared at the ceiling, and I didn't sleep much. I thought about the barbecue. The way he'd laughed at something I'd said before I even told the punchline, like he already knew where I was going. I'd found that so charming. The way he always seemed to know what I needed before I asked for it. I'd called that attentiveness. I'd called that love. I thought about the Denver woman, who I'd never met and whose name Paulette hadn't shared. I thought about what $40,000 means when you lose it that way. I thought about the Tucson woman and whether she ever fully trusted anyone again after. I decided I wasn't going to be either of those women. Not because I was better than them, I'd almost been exactly them, but because Paulette had knocked on the right piece of luck and my father had loved me in a quiet, unobtrusive, absolutely unwavering way, and I was going to do something with that. By 7 a.m. I had a plan. I ordered room service in the new room and ate it, because I'm someone who operates better on breakfast, even when the world is ending. And I read through everything in Paulette's folder twice more, and then I called Sophie again. Sophie was already awake because Sophie is always already awake. She said, "Tell me what you need." I told her. At 9:30 I went back to the original room. I knocked first, which was a strange thing to do on your own honeymoon room, but I needed one beat of warning for myself as much as for him. Brandon opened the door in a hotel robe, holding coffee, hair still messy from sleep. He looked, I want to be honest about this, relieved to see me, and underneath the relief, something else. Calculation. The relief was the mask. The calculation was the machinery. Hey, he said. I was worried. You were gone when I woke up. He looked genuinely concerned. He was good at that. Where did you go? I said I'd had trouble sleeping and gotten a late night snack and fallen asleep on a couch in the lobby lounge. I said I was sorry I hadn't texted. I said it all very naturally because I'd been practicing the tone of it since 6 a.m. His shoulders came down. He smiled. He handed me his coffee cup. Here, you take the rest. That gesture nearly broke me. The casual tenderness of it, that was the part that was real, maybe. Or maybe it was the part he practiced the longest. I still don't fully know. I tipped the coffee and I sat down on the edge of the bed and I said, I was thinking, should we go over that financial paperwork you mentioned? The funding? I feel like it's been sitting there and we should just handle it. He went very still for less than a second. You'd have missed it if you weren't watching for it. Then, oh yeah, we don't have to do that now. We're on vacation. No, I actually want to, I said. I've been thinking about our financial plan and I want to be proactive about it. He got the folder from his bag. He was smooth about it. Unhurried, like this was completely unremarkable. He sat beside me on the bed and he spread the papers out and he started explaining the language and the way you explain something to someone you think won't look too closely. I looked closely. I pointed to the clause about co-management of trust assets. I said, this part here, what does this mean exactly? My voice was perfectly even. He explained it. He used words like efficiency and streamlining and just in case something happens to you. That phrase, just in case something happens to you, landed in my chest like a stone dropping into still water. I'd want to run this by Robin before I sign anything, I said. Robin? His voice shifted almost imperceptibly. Your attorney? Babe, this is just a household document. I know, I said. She's fast. It'll take 5 minutes. I always run things by her, you know that. He backed off, smooth again, easy again, of course, no rush. I said, great. Actually, she has availability this morning. She mentioned being in touch about something else. Would you want to do a quick call with her while we're both here? She can just walk us through it. He said, sure. He said that like it was nothing. Robin was not actually in Maui. She was in Phoenix, in her office, at her desk, because that's where Robin is every weekday at 9:45 in the morning. But we called her on video, and Robin, who I had texted the night before, who had the folder scanned and in her files, who had spent the early morning reviewing the clause language, was absolutely ready. She said hello to us both. She said she reviewed the document I'd sent over. She said it very naturally, like it was routine, like I'd sent it to her weeks ago as part of normal wedding financial planning. Brendan's jaw shifted, barely, but I was watching. Robin said, I do have a few questions about this section here, and she walked through the co-management clause, not accusingly, not theatrically, just precisely and methodically, in the way that Robin does everything. She asked about the account routing numbers specified. She asked who had drafted the document. She asked whether Brandon had prior experience managing trust-protected assets. By the third question, his posture had changed entirely. Robin said, I've also flagged something with Tessa's investment platform that I want to mention. There was a transfer request initiated last night from an unrecognized device. It's been suspended pending review. Brandon looked at me. I looked back at him. There's a movement. I've read about it in the context of physical therapy in trauma response literature, where the body knows something has ended before the mind catches up. I could see it in him. The calculation that had been running in the background of his eyes for God knows how long went quiet. Not gone. Quiet. Reassessing. I want to talk to my own attorney, he said finally. That's you right, Robin said pleasantly. We ended the call. The room was very quiet. Outside, through the balcony glass, the ocean was doing what the ocean does, completely indifferent to the two of us sitting on a hotel bed in the ruins of something. He said, Tessa. Just my name? Nothing after it. I said, I know about Denver and Tucson. The quiet that followed was different from the quiet before. It was complete. I won't go through everything that came after, the conversation that wasn't really a conversation, the way he tried 2 more approaches before he understood they weren't going to work, the moment when the affect dropped, and I saw something underneath it that I don't have a name for. Not remorse. Not quite. Something colder than that. By noon, Paulette had connected us with a family law attorney who practiced in Hawaii. Because jurisdiction matters when you're starting an annulment proceeding in a place you don't live, Robin had the financial documentation packaged. The transfer request had been formally flagged with my investment platform's fraud team. The document Brandon had brought, the spousal fund restructuring agreement, was in Robin's hands to be examined for the names of whoever had drafted it, because someone had drafted it, and that someone was an additional thread. Brandon flew back to Phoenix that afternoon, alone, on a ticket he bought himself with his own card because the credit card we'd shared for honeymoon expenses had been frozen at Robin's recommendation. I stayed in Maui for 4 more days. I know how that sounds. Maybe it sounds strange or self-indulgent or like I was in shock. Maybe it was some of all of those things. But I had already paid for the trip, and the ocean was beautiful. And I had called my dad and he had cried, actually cried, which my father almost never does, and he said, "Tessa, I am so sorry I didn't tell you sooner." And I said, "Dad, you gave me Paulette. That was exactly right." Sophie flew out on the second day. She slept in the second bed in the room. We got a 2-bed when we switched, and we ordered room service, and she brought a Bluetooth speaker, and we sat on the balcony, and she didn't try to fill all the silence, which is one of the reasons she's been my best friend for 10 years. She just sat with me in it. I thought a lot about what I'd learned about myself in those 4 days, that I'm more trusting than I'd realized, and that trust is not the same thing as naive, that my father's brand of love, quiet, backup providing, never overstating itself, is something I'd undervalued for a long time, that I have better instincts than I gave myself credit for, and that listening to the cold tightening in my chest is something I plan to do a lot more of going forward. The annulment was finalized 11 weeks later. Robin handled most of it. It was cleaner than it could have been because the fraud documentation made certain conversations short. Brandon did not contest it. The people in Denver and Tucson, Paulette connected Robin with the attorneys who'd handled those situations. The Denver woman had kept records, as it turned out. She kept everything. The Tucson woman, once contacted through proper channels, was willing to talk. Fraud charges across state lines became possible in a way they hadn't been before, because 2 quiet situations, documented and connected, are a different thing than 1 quiet situation alone. I don't know exactly what happened to Brandon legally. That's not my information to have or to share. What I know is that he is not, as of the last update I received, practicing in the same professional capacity he was before. What I know is that the mutual friend who'd introduced us, who had not known, who had been as deceived as anyone, called me 6 months later to apologize and cried on the phone for a long time. I told her there was nothing to apologize for. What I know is that a woman named Paulette in a linen blazer waited by an elevator bank in a Maui hotel and made a choice to say something when she could have stayed quiet. I asked her later why she'd done it that way. Why not come to me directly, earlier, instead of the hallway warning? She said she'd wanted to make sure I was ready to hear it. She said sometimes people need a moment to realize they're already suspicious before you hand them the evidence. She said you had that look when you left your room, like you were already half knowing. Maybe she was right. Maybe the bath had been too convenient, and the angled text had landed somewhere in me that I hadn't let myself look at yet. Maybe I'd been sitting with it longer than I knew. I'm a physical therapist. I understand recovery. I understand that healing isn't linear and that some damage takes longer to locate than to treat, and that the goal is not to get back to who you were before, it's to build strength in the places that were tested. I'm good. I want to be clear about that. I'm genuinely good. My grandmother's trust is intact. My name is still Harlow. And the first Sunday of every month, I call my dad, and I don't bring up the wedding unless he does. But sometimes at the end of the call he says, quietly, the way he says the things that matter, "You doing all right, Tess?" And I am. There's a version of this story where I go back to that room, where I brush off what Paulette said, tell myself a stranger in a hotel hallway has no business warning me about my own marriage, and I go back in and hand my husband the coffee and sign the paperwork 2 days later without reading it closely enough. That version of this story exists. I almost lived it. What stopped it wasn't luck exactly, it was a combination of things I didn't fully recognize as strength until I had to use them all at once. My dad's quiet, persistent sense that something was off, and his choice to do something about it without stripping my agency away. Paulette's decision to say something when silence would have been easier. Robin's readiness at 10 p.m. on a weeknight. Sophie's presence 2 days later on a balcony in Maui, not filling the silence. And somewhere underneath all of it, my own willingness to sit in a hotel hallway with an ice bucket and actually let myself feel the cold tightening in my chest instead of explaining it away. I thought a lot about the Denver woman. I don't know her name. I probably never will. But I think about the $40,000 she lost, and more than that, I think about what it costs to lose something that way, to discover that someone you trusted engineered the circumstances of your meeting, studied your vulnerability, and played a long game against you while holding your hand. The money heals, the recalibration of who you believe and why, that takes longer. What I've landed on after all of it is that there are 3 things that actually protected me, and none of them were luck. The first is that the people around me operated with integrity even when I wasn't watching. My dad didn't tell me about Paulette because he wanted credit, he told me through her actions. The second is that I used my mind when my heart wanted to collapse. I didn't storm back into that room. I sat down. I opened the app. I called Sophie. I thought. Clear thinking in the middle of crisis is something you can practice, and I'm grateful I had enough of it when it mattered. The third is that I didn't quit when it would have been easier to. I stayed in that lounge until I understood the whole picture. I showed up the next morning, ordered breakfast, read the folder twice. I made the call with Robin. I sat on that bed and I kept my voice even when every part of me wanted to break. None of that is magic. All of it is a choice, made repeatedly in small moments that add up to a life you can live with. Brandon's choices had their own logic too. Every decision he made, engineering the introduction, the long con, the carefully drafted paperwork, those choices compounded just as surely as mine did. That's how it works. What you do accumulates. The pattern of who you are has a direction, and eventually you arrive at the destination your choices have been building toward. His destination was a conversation in a conference room with a forensic accountant and a printed transcript. Mine was a balcony in Maui with my best friend and 4 more days of ocean. I used to think the ocean was indifferent. I'm not sure about that anymore. I think it's just patient. It doesn't hurry. It doesn't explain itself. It keeps going. I'm trying to be more like that.